In the upscale city of Friendswood, Texas, David and Clara Harris lived what seemed like the perfect life. At 44, David was a successful orthodontist and Clara, 45, was a respected dentist. Together, they built a beautiful family and a thriving dental practice. But on a fateful night in July 2002, everything changed. After discovering David's affair, Clara's devastation turned into uncontrollable rage, and in a moment that shocked the nation, she ran over her husband with her car, ending his life. This is the tragic story of love, betrayal, and murder, David and Clara Harris. David Harris's affair with Gail Bridges was the catalyst for the tragic events that unfolded on July 24, 2002. David, a 44-year-old successful orthodontist, had been married to Clara for 10 years. Together, they had built a successful dental practice, and from the outside, their life appeared perfect. However, beneath the surface, things were far from ideal. Over time, their marriage began to show signs of strain, with David feeling increasingly distanced from Clara. In search of excitement and validation, he began an extramarital affair with Gail Bridges, a 30-year-old receptionist who worked at his office. The affair began as flirtatious exchanges in the office, with David finding in Gail the admiration and attention he felt was lacking at home. As weeks passed, their relationship became more serious. David started meeting Gail outside the office, and their interactions grew increasingly intimate. What began as a secretive fling developed into a full-blown relationship, with David and Gail frequently meeting at hotels and restaurants, away from the eyes of his wife and colleagues. Gail, who was aware that David was married, was equally invested in the affair. She often accompanied David on trips and shared intimate moments, giving David an escape from the pressures of his marriage and work life. The affair was not just physical. It became emotional, with David confiding in Gail about the difficulties in his marriage. He told her about his dissatisfaction with his life at home and painted a picture of a strained relationship with Clara. As their relationship deepened, David began to talk about the possibility of leaving Clara to be with Gail, giving her hope for a future together. Clara had begun to notice subtle changes in David's behavior. He became more distant, often coming home late from work and spending long hours on his phone. David's once attentive nature had shifted, and Clara's suspicions grew. His constant excuses, coupled with a growing emotional gap between them, left Clara feeling confused and anxious about their marriage. David's infidelity was still hidden, but his emotional absence was undeniable. Despite his affair with Gail, David continued to maintain his marriage to Clara. The dual life he led created an immense amount of strain, but he was unwilling to immediately confront the situation or end the relationship with either woman. For David, the affair provided an escape, but it was also something he had not fully committed to resolving. He enjoyed the excitement and newness Gail brought to his life while simultaneously keeping his marriage intact for the sake of their public image and shared business. As David and Gail's affair progressed, Clara's suspicions reached a tipping point. She began noticing inconsistencies in David's stories and unexplained absences. Eventually, she hired a private investigator, determined to uncover the truth. The investigator soon confirmed Clara's worst fears. David was indeed having an affair with Gail. The evidence included photographs of David and Gail entering hotels together, detailed accounts of their meetings, and records of their frequent rendezvous. Clara's world, which had already been fragile, came crashing down when she learned the full extent of David's betrayal. This discovery left Clara emotionally devastated. Her husband, whom she had trusted for over a decade, had been living a double life. The affair was not just a fling. It was a serious relationship with another woman who had become deeply involved in their lives. The emotional and physical intimacy David shared with Gail created a deep sense of betrayal for Clara, and the knowledge that he had been seeing Gail regularly at hotels and other secret locations filled her with anger and heartbreak. Clara's reaction to the affair was a mixture of pain, rage, and disbelief. The betrayal was not only personal but public. David had chosen someone from his office, someone close enough to their lives that Clara could not escape the constant reminder of his infidelity. The humiliation of the affair being exposed left Clara feeling desperate, and the thought of losing her marriage pushed her into an emotional spiral. For David, the affair represented a temporary escape, but it also created the perfect storm of emotional conflict. He was torn between his responsibility to Clara and his feelings for Gail, who was expecting him to leave his wife. The pressure from both women, coupled with the weight of his own deceit, left David in an unsustainable position. He had promised both women different things: Clara, his loyalty as a husband, and Gail, the hope of a new life together. As Clara's investigation revealed more about the affair, the emotional tension between her and David intensified. The affair was no longer a secret, and it became clear that Clara would not allow this betrayal to go unchallenged. Her decision to confront David and Gail at the hotel marked the culmination of months of emotional anguish. David's infidelity had fractured their relationship beyond repair, and the affair became the central issue that would ultimately lead to the violent confrontation on that fateful night. David's affair with Gail was not just a betrayal of his marriage vows. It was a deep emotional rupture that left Clara feeling utterly betrayed. The ongoing deceit and the hope that David had given to Gail complicated matters even further, creating a triangle of unresolved emotions. Each party, David, Clara, and Gail, was entrenched in the affair's consequences, unable to foresee how it would all tragically unfold. The night of July 24, 2002, began as a confrontation but spiraled into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The tension had been building for weeks, and by the time Clara Harris arrived at the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel, she was already overwhelmed by emotions of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. She had just learned, through a private investigator she had hired, that her husband, David Harris, was meeting his mistress, Gail Bridges, at the hotel. Clara, a successful 44-year-old dentist and mother of twin boys, was consumed with rage after discovering the depth of David's infidelity. As Clara pulled into the parking lot that evening, she spotted David and Gail exiting the hotel together. Clara's mind raced. The sight of her husband with another woman, especially in such an intimate setting, set off an emotional explosion within her. The moment Clara had feared was now a reality in front of her, and it was too much for her to bear. The confrontation began immediately. Clara got out of her silver Mercedes-Benz and marched toward David and Gail. Her emotions boiled over as she hurled accusations at David, demanding to know how he could betray her after years of marriage. Witnesses later described Clara as being visibly distraught and enraged, with her voice cracking under the weight of her feelings. David tried to calm her down, but the tension between them was palpable. Gail, uncomfortable with the scene, tried to distance herself from the escalating argument. David, caught between his wife and his mistress, was trying to de-escalate the situation, but Clara was inconsolable. Words were exchanged, sharp, heated, and full of emotional pain. The argument was not just about the affair, but about the life Clara believed they had built together, now shattered by David's betrayal. Onlookers in the parking lot saw the intense scene unfold, but none could have predicted what would happen next. After the argument reached its peak, Clara stormed back to her car. The weight of the betrayal had pushed her over the edge. Seething with rage and desperation, Clara started her car, and in that moment, her emotions overtook her judgment. With David standing in the parking lot, she revved the engine and drove the car straight at him. The Mercedes struck David with significant force, sending him flying to the ground. But Clara didn't stop there. In a blind fury, she circled the parking lot and ran over David's body again, and then again. Bystanders, horrified by what they were witnessing, watched as Clara repeatedly drove over David. Some described seeing the car lurch forward and backward, each time making sure David was struck again. The violence of the act was shocking. Clara's rage, previously verbal, had now manifested in a brutal, physical way. One of the most disturbing aspects of the night was that Clara's stepdaughter, Lindsay Harris, who had been in the car with Clara during the entire ordeal, witnessed the killing. Lindsay had been aware of her father's affair, and her relationship with her stepmother had always been complex. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw that night. According to later testimony, Lindsay screamed for Clara to stop, but Clara, blinded by her anger and pain, ignored the cries and continued to crush David's body under the weight of the vehicle. Surveillance cameras positioned around the hotel's parking lot captured every agonizing second of Clara's rampage. The footage, later used in the trial, showed the car repeatedly running over David's body in a shocking and deliberate act of violence. The repetitive motion of the Mercedes-Benz over David left no doubt in anyone's mind. This was no accident. It was an act of pure rage. Once Clara finally stopped, the parking lot was eerily silent. David lay motionless on the ground, his body broken from the multiple impacts. Onlookers rushed over, but it was too late. The injuries were catastrophic, and David was pronounced dead at the scene. Emergency responders who arrived at the scene were stunned by the brutality of what had occurred. Clara, meanwhile, stood by her car in shock, as if the gravity of what she had done was only beginning to sink in. When the police arrived, they immediately arrested Clara. She was calm, almost detached, as they led her away from the scene. Her actions that night had irrevocably changed her life and the lives of everyone involved. The crime shocked the nation, not only because of the nature of the act, but because of the deep emotional context that surrounded it. The media frenzy that followed painted a vivid picture of the events leading up to that fateful night. The affair, the confrontation, and the violent outburst that led to David Harris's death became the focal point of endless public debate. Clara, a once respected professional and mother, had now become the face of one of the most notorious crimes in Texas history. The surveillance footage, combined with the witness testimonies and the tragic death of David Harris, left no doubt that Clara had acted out of overwhelming rage. As the night came to a close, the scene at the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel remained etched in the minds of those who had witnessed the crime. David's death was not just a tragic end to an affair, but a devastating moment born from deep emotional betrayal. For Clara Harris, the night represented the irreversible consequences of allowing anger and heartbreak to take control, leading to a violent and fatal act that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The trial of Clara Harris became one of the most high-profile cases in Texas in 2003, not only due to the violent nature of David Harris's death, but also because of the personal and emotional turmoil surrounding the affair and the act of revenge. The trial unfolded in a media frenzy, with the case drawing widespread national attention. The dramatic elements of the story, a respected dentist turned murderer, a love triangle, the brutal death of a husband, and the surveillance footage of Clara's car repeatedly running over David, made it a perfect storm for public fascination. Clara Harris was charged with first-degree murder, and the prosecution built their case around the assertion that Clara had committed an intentional and premeditated act of violence. The surveillance footage from the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel parking lot, which captured Clara's Mercedes-Benz running over David multiple times, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's evidence. The graphic nature of the video was played for the jury, showcasing the horrifying brutality of the crime and making it clear that Clara's actions were deliberate. The prosecution argued that Clara, consumed by jealousy and anger over David's affair with Gail Bridges, had sought revenge in the most violent way possible. The media frenzy that erupted around the case made it a national spectacle. Reporters and television crews camped outside the courthouse, covering every detail of the trial. News outlets sensationalized the story, focusing on the love triangle, Clara's seemingly perfect life, and the devastating consequences of David's infidelity. Headlines screamed about the scorned wife, who ran over her cheating husband in a fit of rage. Clara became a symbol of emotional devastation and the destructive power of jealousy, and her face was plastered across television screens and newspapers for weeks. Throughout the trial, Clara's defense team argued that her actions were the result of temporary insanity, driven by extreme emotional distress. They painted a picture of Clara as a devoted wife who had been pushed beyond her limits after discovering her husband's betrayal. Clara had dedicated years to building a life with David, both personally and professionally, and the discovery of his affair shattered her. The defense emphasized that she had acted in the heat of the moment, overcome by intense emotions, and had not premeditated the murder. Clara's defense attorneys also brought her stepdaughter, Lindsay Harris, to the stand. Lindsay's testimony added another emotional layer to the case, as she had been in the car with Clara when the murder occurred. Lindsay testified that her stepmother had become hysterical when she saw David with Gail, and that Clara had been acting out of sheer emotional devastation, rather than planning to kill him. This testimony, while sympathetic to Clara's emotional state, also reinforced the horrifying reality that a child had witnessed the murder of her father at the hands of her stepmother. Another pivotal moment in the trial was when the prosecution showed the surveillance footage of the crime to the jury. The video was a damning piece of evidence, as it clearly showed Clara's car circling the parking lot and repeatedly running over David's body. The brutality of the act was undeniable, and it was difficult for the defense to mitigate the impact of the footage. The video also became a key element in the media's portrayal of Clara, turning her into a symbol of a jealous wife driven to violent extremes. Public interest in the trial was heightened by the fact that David and Clara had both been prominent figures in the community. As successful professionals, they had presented an image of a perfect family life, which only made the revelations of the affair and the murder more shocking. The media covered every aspect of the trial in excruciating detail, from the forensic evidence to the personal testimonies, turning the trial into a real-life drama that captivated the public. The juxtaposition of Clara's outwardly calm and successful persona with the violence of her crime fascinated audiences across the country. The jury deliberated for hours before returning a verdict. Despite the defense's argument that Clara had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, the evidence was overwhelmingly against her. The surveillance footage, the witness testimonies, and the undeniable violence of the act all pointed to her guilt. In February 2003, Clara Harris was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay a $10,000 fine. The media frenzy did not end with the verdict. In fact, the trial's conclusion only intensified public interest, with debates raging about whether Clara's sentence was too lenient or too harsh. Some argued that Clara had been driven to the edge by her husband's betrayal and that her actions, while inexcusable, were understandable in the context of her emotional breakdown. Others felt that her punishment was not severe enough for the brutal nature of the crime. The case also raised broader discussions in the media about the effects of infidelity and emotional betrayal. Clara's actions became a cautionary tale about the destructive power of jealousy, and her story was discussed on talk shows, news programs, and in editorial columns across the country. The public's fascination with the case lingered for years, and Clara's name became synonymous with the infamous crime of running over her husband in a fit of jealous rage. Even after her sentencing, Clara Harris continued to make headlines. In interviews and media appearances, she expressed remorse for her actions, describing herself as a woman who had lost control in a moment of emotional agony. Clara's story became a lasting part of true crime history, a reminder of how love, betrayal, and unchecked emotions can culminate in unthinkable violence. The media coverage of the trial, with its focus on the affair, the murder, and the emotional fallout, ensured that the case would remain a touchstone in discussions about crime and punishment for years to come. After a highly publicized trial, Clara Harris was convicted of murder on February 14, 2003. The jury deliberated for a mere 18 hours before finding her guilty of killing her husband, David Harris, by running him over multiple times with her Mercedes-Benz in the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel parking lot. The emotional trial had captivated the nation, and the guilty verdict seemed to many like the inevitable conclusion of the tragic tale. Despite Clara's defense, which had claimed she acted in a state of temporary insanity, the jury was unconvinced, especially in light of the damning surveillance footage that showed her deliberately running over David. Clara Harris was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum penalty she could receive under Texas law for the crime of sudden passion murder. In addition to the prison term, she was fined $10,000. The prosecution had argued that Clara's actions were premeditated and that she had intended to kill David after discovering his affair with Gail Bridges. The defense, on the other hand, portrayed Clara as a woman who had lost control in the heat of the moment, driven by emotional pain and betrayal. The jury's verdict made it clear that while they believed her actions were spurred by emotional distress, they also considered the level of violence and the repeated actions of running over David too severe to justify leniency. The sentencing brought a sense of closure to the legal proceedings, but the aftermath of the trial left lingering emotional wounds for all those involved. David Harris's family, including his teenage daughter Lindsay, struggled to come to terms with the loss of a father and husband in such a brutal manner. Lindsay, who had been in the car with Clara during the crime, had a particularly difficult time reconciling her stepmother's actions with the woman she had known growing up. The trauma of witnessing her father's murder was compounded by the complexities of her relationship with Clara, who had been both a parental figure and her father's killer. In the years following her conviction, Clara Harris's case remained in the spotlight. She became a symbol of how jealousy and betrayal could lead to unthinkable acts of violence. The media continued to follow her story, and Clara herself made public statements expressing deep remorse for her actions. She insisted that she had not intended to kill David that night, that she had simply lost control in a moment of overwhelming pain. Clara's supporters, including some members of her family, stood by her, maintaining that she had acted out of immense emotional suffering caused by David's infidelity. However, David's family, particularly his daughter Lindsay, remained divided over Clara's role in his death. Lindsay, who had once been close to Clara, became estranged from her after the murder, though she later testified that she believed Clara's actions had stemmed from extreme emotional distress. Despite this, Lindsay struggled with the trauma of witnessing the crime and the devastating impact it had on her family. Clara's imprisonment, while bringing an end to her public life, continued to attract media attention. Over the years, she was interviewed from prison, maintaining that she deeply regretted her actions. She described her time behind bars as one of intense reflection, saying that she had come to terms with the consequences of her emotions spiraling out of control that night. Despite this remorse, Clara's legal team repeatedly sought parole for her, and in 2018, after serving 15 years of her 20-year sentence, she was released from prison on parole. Upon her release, Clara Harris attempted to rebuild her life in relative obscurity. The public's memory of her crime, however, continued to linger, and her name remained associated with one of the most infamous cases of crimes of passion in Texas. The aftermath of the murder affected not only Clara and David's family, but also ignited discussions in the media and public sphere about the intersections of infidelity, emotional distress, and violence. Clara's story became a cautionary tale of how unchecked emotions, jealousy, and betrayal can culminate in irreversible tragedy. For David's family, the pain of his loss never truly faded. His death left a void that no amount of media coverage or legal proceedings could fill. The trial, verdict, and Clara's eventual release all contributed to a complex and painful legacy for everyone involved, particularly for David's children. Even as Clara walked free after serving her time, the emotional and psychological scars of that night persisted, a reminder that while justice had been served, the deeper wounds of betrayal and loss remained for those who had lived through the nightmare. The case of Clara Harris offers a sobering reflection on the nature of a crime of passion, a category of crime that is often driven by intense emotional turmoil rather than calculated malice. Crimes of passion, as illustrated in Clara's tragic story, occur when a person's overwhelming emotions, such as jealousy, anger, or betrayal, override their ability to think rationally. These crimes often arise from deeply personal situations, such as infidelity, and can lead to violent outcomes when emotions reach a breaking point. Clara's actions, while horrific, stem from a moment of emotional devastation and psychological collapse. In legal terms, crimes of passion are distinct from premeditated acts of violence. The key factor lies in the absence of planning. The crime is typically spontaneous, committed in the heat of the moment when the individual's emotions are so heightened that they act without forethought. Clara, who had been a respected dentist, wife, and mother, did not go to the Nassau Bay Hilton intending to kill her husband. However, when confronted with the undeniable proof of David's affair, her overwhelming feelings of betrayal and rage led her to commit an act that she likely would not have considered under normal circumstances. Reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that crimes of passion often blur the line between victim and perpetrator. Clara, who was a victim of her husband's infidelity, became the perpetrator of his murder. Her actions were driven by the intense pain of discovering that the man she had loved and trusted had betrayed her with another woman. But while the emotional context of the crime may generate sympathy, it does not absolve the perpetrator of responsibility. Clara's inability to control her emotions led to the destruction of not only her own life but also the lives of her children, David's family, and Gail Bridges. The psychological aspects of a crime of passion also highlight how unchecked emotions can lead to tragic consequences. Clara Harris had built her identity around her marriage and her role as a wife and mother. The discovery of David's affair shattered her sense of self, leading to feelings of humiliation, inadequacy, and betrayal. In that moment of confrontation, her emotional pain turned into violent rage. The human brain, under extreme emotional distress, can act impulsively, prioritizing the need for immediate relief from pain over any long-term consequences. In Clara's case, her response was fatal. Crimes of passion also force society to consider the broader implications of emotional control and the triggers that lead to such actions. While not everyone who experiences betrayal or anger will resort to violence, the case serves as a reminder of the potential for extreme emotional reactions to cause irreparable damage. It brings to light the importance of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and, perhaps most crucially, seeking help before emotions escalate to a point of no return. Additionally, the legal system's approach to crimes of passion reflects the complexity of these cases. While Clara was convicted of murder, her sentence of 20 years was significantly less than what she might have received for a premeditated act. The court recognized that Clara's actions were fueled by her emotional state rather than cold calculation. This distinction between premeditation and spontaneous violence is a key element in how crimes of passion are treated in court, with judges and juries often weighing the emotional context when determining sentences. At the heart of Clara Harris's case, and of any crime of passion, is a stark reflection on the fragility of human emotions. It is a reminder that while we may consider ourselves rational beings, emotions have the power to drive us to actions we would never otherwise contemplate. In Clara's case, the emotional devastation of betrayal led her to take a life, forever altering her own and the lives of those around her. It serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of unchecked emotions and the need for emotional support and intervention before moments of passion spiral into violence. The Clara Harris case is a tragic reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed when emotions, especially jealousy and betrayal, spiral out of control. What began as a seemingly perfect life, a loving wife, a successful career, and a family, was undone in a moment of violent passion. Clara's crime was not a coldly calculated act of malice, but a devastating reaction to overwhelming emotional pain. Her story reflects the darker side of human nature, where unchecked emotions and feelings of betrayal can lead to irreversible consequences. While Clara's case drew widespread media attention for its sensational details, at its core, it is a tale of loss, of love, of trust, of life. The trial and media frenzy may have brought temporary closure to the legal proceedings, but the emotional fallout left scars on everyone involved, especially David's family and children. Clara's actions serve as a stark warning of the dangers of letting emotions overpower reason. Ultimately, the case leaves us with the sobering truth that love, betrayal, and anger are powerful forces, capable of driving even the most stable individuals to commit unthinkable acts. It underscores the importance of emotional resilience and the need for healthy coping mechanisms in the face of deep emotional turmoil. Clara Harris's story, though tragic, can serve as a reminder of the human capacity for both passion and destruction, and the need to seek help before emotions escalate beyond control.